Hi, hope you're well. This is the Metabo SXE450 Turbotech, a 150mm or 6-inch random orbital sander, and I bought this one recently to see if it was still worth considering in 2025. Now, I've looked at sanders before, especially the various Merkur Deros-alike Far Eastern copies, and I've got to be honest, I was surprised at just how much those have gone up in price. The Sealy branded version of this Banggood Special is now over a couple of £100, and I was reminded in the 10-Minute Workshop forums about this Metabo sander from way back. I had the older version of this, the 450 Duo, back in the early 2000s when I was just starting out, because back then it was the mid-range sander to beat. Best part of 20 years on, and it's still available, albeit in a slightly different version. But is it really worth considering in the light of all the competition? Well, it does have one trick up its sleeve, which I think makes it unique. But before we get to that, let's go back and get that box opened and see what's what. I paid just under £135 for this 240-volt version. It is also available in 110 volts, and there's not a whole lot in the box. There's the sander, a removable front handle. That's handy not to have that fitted when you need to get into a tight corner. There's a book of words and a dust bag, and that's about it. I won't bore you with the specs. I'll put a link in the description for that, but in short, it's a solid 350-watt sander that weighs in at a little under 3 kilos or a little over 6 pounds. That's twice the weight, 3 pounds more than the latest Festool ETS-EC for comparison, but far fewer pounds, of course, when it comes to the price. The 150mm or 6-inch Velcro pad is replaceable, but as far as I know, it can't be swapped for the smaller 125mm or 5-inch pad. Metabo do make a 5-inch version of this sander, the SXE450, so if the smaller size suits you better, that may be the one to look at, though that sander is not identical to this one, so be sure to do your own research on it. There's variable speed on a dial on the front of the sander, and a turbo button too, which as far as I can tell overrides whatever's set on the speed dial and bumps up the top speed to make it a little more aggressive. And most importantly, the sander comes with a 4-meter mains cable, which makes me very happy. As I say, there's a dust bag and a very simple non-proprietary all-metal round dust port that fits all the usual hoses. Nice to see a power tool that's still made in the EU, by the way. Hungary, not Germany, but still good to see that not all manufacturing has been outsourced further east. So this is a random orbital sander. I've done videos on sanders before that explains the difference between the various types of sander, but in short, a regular orbital sander moves in a predictable pattern and orbit, whereas a random orbital sander, the pad is allowed to move freely, so it moves around the orbit in a more random way, which helps to prevent repeated scratch patterns or pigtails on the workpiece. Random orbital sanders are great all-rounders for general work, from stripping paint to prepping a surface for a finer finish. And the amount of movement there is in the pad is called the stroke or the orbit. It's a simplification, but typically a smaller orbit will give a finer finish, and the larger the orbit or stroke, then the more aggressive the sander will be, so better for rougher work. Most random orbital finishing sanders have a stroke of between 2 and 3mm, and the more aggressive sanders are typically a 5mm stroke, though some specialist tools do go up to 7mm and beyond. Now this is where the Metabo gets properly interesting, and to the best of my knowledge unique, because this sander is dual orbit, so it has both a fine finish 2.8mm stroke and a much more aggressive 6.2mm stroke, all in the same sander. Now that's a pretty good trick for any sander, but especially one at this kind of price, and most companies would want you to buy 2 separate sanders at any price to get that same kind of flexibility. I do want to be clear though, this is simply 2 different sized random orbits in the same sander. It's not the same as the Festool Rotex, say, that has 2 different types, a gear driven and a random orbital option in one sander. That's a very different animal, and I've discussed that in other videos that I'll link below. So how do you get those 2 different orbits? Well, unfortunately, this is where it starts to fall down a little in usability, because it's not quite as simple as flicking a switch like you do to engage the turbo boost, or the pull and twist of the lever like you did on the original Rotex. On the Metabo, you have to depress a button on the side of the machine and rotate the pad until you hear a click. and then you have to rotate the pad a further 180 degrees with the button still depressed. And then you know that you're in the orbit that you weren't in before, and you can release the button. Yeah, there's no visual indication of where you are on the tool, and if you don't have the experience to know or feel the difference between the two orbits, then this could be a little bit confusing for some, especially for new users. I know I found it a little fiddly back when I had mine, especially after the sticker on the side that shows the process wore off, but with a little bit of practice and perseverance, you can easily get the hang of it. The initial click is very distinctive, and the end of the 180-degree turn is less so, but there's a feeling of something like a ball indent engaging in there. And there are small holes in the side of the backing pad that gives you a visual clue of how far you've turned it as well. In use, the sander does what it says on the tin. The larger orbit is great for getting some rough sawn timber back to something decent. And the smaller orbit will give a fine finish ready for a wax or an oil, or just for denibbing between coats of paint. It is essentially a 20-odd-year-old design though, so it's a little tall in comparison to the current sanders. The only time I found that to be a problem was when I was refinishing a kitchen floor once, when it wouldn't actually fit under the cabinets, and you do need to be a little careful working on edges as it can be a little bit tippy. I always recommend having a random orbital sander alongside a small orbital or palm sander as well where possible, as these two options cover a lot of ground between them. Okay, so far so good. You might be wondering, well, if this dual orbit is such a great idea, then why aren't all sanders, all manufacturers using it? Well, in part, that probably comes down to simple commerce. If a company can sell you two separate sanders, then that's a better business proposition for them at least. And partly it'll be the same reason that not every sander has a gear-driven option like Festool's Rotex or the Makita, whatever it is. And that's simply that the design itself is a trade-off between the functionality that you get and the weight that it adds to the tool. Now, sometimes a bit of weight isn't an issue, as woodworkers we're more likely to be sanding on the flat horizontally, and a bit of extra heft there does no harm. It makes the sander less skittish and easier to control in many ways, but start using that sander vertically against a wall or even overhead like on a ceiling, and that story changes pretty fast. As always, it comes down to what you want and how you expect to use the tool. 10 Minute Workshop Plus member Graham does some regular maintenance work for a chain of pubs and finds the Metabo to be a solid performer that can take the knocks of being carted around from place to place while still providing both aggressive and fine finish sanding, and all in just the one tool to carry. And I know that my YouTube pal Ollie Bradshaw at Bradshaw Jewellery has used his original version of this sander, the one that I had, very extensively and speaks highly of it as well. You may have seen me mention in a previous video when I said I'm putting together a basic toolkit for my son, who's a new homeowner and looking to get into a bit of DIY and light woodworking. And he has a couple of projects coming up where a bigger sander like this would be useful. One of those is to refinish some decking where the aggressive sanding will be handy. And he also wants to make some alcove units where he'll be looking for a finer finish, so the smaller stroke will be useful too. So I think this is a pretty good choice for him. Far better than a cheap and cheerful starter sander from the DIY shed, but still perfectly capable too. And if he starts to get into needing to sand his ceilings, well, he can either bulk up a little or figure out some other option for that. Certainly, as long as you can live with the weight, the height, and the slightly fiddly way to change the stroke, the orbit, then for the money, I think this is a great choice, even after all this time. Or maybe like me, you just prefer a sander with a switch rather than a flappy paddle. Well, this is a solid option. If you have this sander, let me know down below how you find it. My son will be doing the long-term test on this and all the other tools in his toolkit, so I'll be sure to keep you posted on how all that goes. But I'll call this one done for today. Thanks so much for taking a look. As always, leave a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll catch you next time. Take care.